evening, and welcome to Samford University's Leslie S. Wright Fine Arts Center via live stream. I am Dr. Anna McEwen, and I serve as the Dean of the Orlean Beeson School of Education. It is a pleasure to welcome you tonight to the 10th anniversary Tom and Marla Corts Distinguished Author Series featuring Patti Callahan Henry. The names Tom and Marla Corts have been synonymous with Samford University for more than 3 decades. Tom Corts was known for his invaluable leadership and service, as well as his love of books and classical literature. In 2011, the Tom and Marla Corts Distinguished Author Series was established to recognize the Corts' leadership to the university, the community, and the cause of literacy. We are honored to have the Corts family's support in making this evening possible. And I, on behalf of Samford's family, wish to share our gratitude for the many ways their legacy continues to enrich the Samford experience. Join me now as we look back over the last decade and celebrate the impact of this special event.
The names Tom and Marla Corts have been synonymous with Samford University for 3 decades. The late Thomas Corts, who was president of Samford for 23 years, was known for his invaluable leadership, service, and love for books and classical literature. His wife Marla is a former high school English teacher for whom a missionary biography collection in the Samford Library is named. In 2011, the Tom and Marla Corts Distinguished Author Series was established to recognize the Corts' invaluable leadership to the university, the community, and the cause of literacy.
We are so grateful that the Corts family continues to support this event so that we may further the Samford experience for all of our students.
The Thomas E. and Marla Haas Corts Endowment provides support to host an annual visiting author who is not only a notable name in their field, but challenges, inspires, and expands the thinking of students to become more engaged in matters of significant intellectual or historical interest in vital issues of the day.
My prayer each year is that there will be a nugget of truth shared that will be long-lasting in the lives of those in attendance, and that will bless their lives spiritually, mentally, and emotionally.
We have been inspired from one of the most beloved and admired former American First Ladies, Laura Bush, who has championed key issues in the field of education, healthcare, and human rights. We have been moved by the perspectives of celebrated writer and poet Wendell Berry, and we have been challenged by the faith and generosity presented in the memoir of Eric Motley. We have enjoyed learning from the insights of Greg Mortensen, Garrison Keeler, Wes Moore, Parker Palmer, Philip Yancey, and Anthony Ray Hinton.
What makes me proud about the series is the caliber of our authors from year 1 to year 10 has never wavered, and we've gotten to hear world-class authors each year, authorities in their subject, and I can't wait to see what's going to happen in the next 10 years.
In celebration of its 10th anniversary, we recognize the tremendous impact and value the Tom and Marla Corts Distinguished Author Series has brought to Samford University. It will continue to do so for many years to come.
At this time, would you join me in prayer? Dear God, thank you that you promise us that where 2 or 3 are gathered, even virtually, you are there in our midst. So Lord, we are grateful for your presence tonight and the blessing of technology that allows us to connect with so many. We ask that you open our ears to hear your voice through Mrs. Henry's words, open our minds to perceive your wisdom, and open our spirits so that we may follow your leading. And now, O Lord, will you extend your hand of blessing on this event? In the name of Jesus, amen. It is my privilege to introduce to you Dr. Michael Harden, Samford University's Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Dean McEwen, and it's a pleasure to welcome everyone tonight. This is an exciting series. I enjoy being a part of it each year, and I think we have had outstanding authors each year. Tonight we have Patti Callahan Henry. She's a New York Times and USA Today best-selling author of 15 novels, including the historical fiction entitled Becoming Mrs. Lewis, the improbable love story of Joy Daberman and C.S. Lewis. In addition, she is the recipient of the Christie Award, a 2019 winner Book of the Year, the Harper Lee Distinguished Writer of the Year for 2020, and the Alabama Association Book of the Year for 2019. The author is also the host of a popular 7-part original Behind the Scenes of Becoming Mrs. Lewis podcast series, which launched October 2019. Her upcoming historical fiction, Surviving Savannah, will be released on March 9th, 2021. Growing up in Philadelphia as the daughter of a Presbyterian minister, Patti learned early the value of storytelling. At the age of 12, her family moved to South Florida, where Patti found the sanctuary of libraries and began her slow but steady journey into understanding the power of story to navigate confusing times in life. Patti attended Auburn University for her undergraduate work and Georgia State University for her undergraduate degree. Once a pediatric clinical nurse specialist, she now writes full-time. The mother of 3 children, she now lives in both Mountain Brook, Alabama, and Bluffton, South Carolina, with her husband. We are proud to welcome Patti Callahan Henry to Samford University and to have her be part of the 10th anniversary of the Tom and Marla Corts Distinguished Authors Series presented by the Orland Beeson School of Education. Patti, welcome.
Hello, I am so thrilled to be here. I am honored to be here for the 10th year of this series, and when I watched that video with the rest of you, I was just in awe of the people who have been here and the people who I read and respect, and thank you for everyone for having me here. If we should ever grow brave, what on earth would become of us? I wish I'd written that, but I didn't. That is a line from Joy Davidman, the woman who this novel, Becoming Mrs. Lewis, is about. I found that line in the middle of an essay she wrote in the late 1940s. It was an essay called The Long Way Round, and it was an essay in a book of conversion essays. Her husband's essay was in the same book. And when I read that sentence, tucked away and hidden inside that essay, not only did I love the question, if we should ever grow brave, what on earth would become of us, but I loved the sentence as a writer, the way it was structured, the way the just right word was put in the just right place. If we should ever grow brave, what on earth would become of us? Which is where the title Becoming came from, Becoming Mrs. Lewis. And I rushed through that essay wondering what would ever happen if we should grow brave, meaning we might not be there yet, but what would happen if we grew into it? And I read the whole essay, and she didn't answer the question that she asked. And at first I was a bit annoyed with Joy Davidman, and then I realized as I started to research her life that she answered that question with her life, that she grew into the answer to that question as she became the wife of C.S. Lewis. So we all fall in love with C.S. Lewis at different times in our life and for different reasons. I fell in love with C.S. Lewis when I was about 12 years old. My dad is a pastor, and so his library was lined with C.S. Lewis books. And at that age, I would read a cereal box if I was bored. I was such a reader. And I pulled off his shelf the Screw Tape Letters. Yeah, you shouldn't read the Screw Tape Letters when you're 12 years old. But I did, and then of course, just like everyone else, I fell through the wardrobe door of Narnia. And I have been reading Lewis all of my life, and I have found that his books mean different things at different times in our life. And I think it's that way with any book, because books are the living things. Books aren't stagnant words on a page that stay the way they are. The best books are living things that change as we change. So we can pick up a book and then pick it up again 15 years later, and it is a completely different story and means something else entirely to us. And that's how Lewis was for me. But C.S. Lewis only loved one woman, and it wasn't me. He only loved one woman enough to marry, one woman that he called Earth, Stars, Air, and Water. That woman was Joy Davidman. Her name was Helen Joy Davidman Gresham, and eventually Lewis, called Joy. His name was Clive Staples Lewis, but he was called Jack to his friends and to Joy. And their 10-year love story has produced more books, movies, gossip, theory, and now a novel than almost any love story I know of. So why, when we hear about Joy Davidman, why do we always think of her as the dying wife of C.S. Lewis? Why has this always been our image? If we know about her at all, we know of her as the dying wife of C.S. Lewis. And maybe that's because it's always easier to put people into a box. It's always easier to describe someone with a couple sentences. You know, Joy Davidman, the woman, the wife of C.S. Lewis that died tragically and broke his heart. But when I read A Grief Observed, I realized that she was much more than that. If you have ever read the book A Grief Observed, it is one of the most profound books on grief ever written. When C.S. Lewis wrote it, he wrote it right after Joy Davidman died. And he actually wrote it under a pseudonym. He wrote it under the name N.W. Clerk. And it was not put under his real name until he passed. And when I read how he felt in that novel, when I read of his extreme grief, it's still one of the best and most profound opening lines of any book I've ever read, which is, I never knew that grief felt so like fear. And that was all about Joy Davidman. And so I always wondered, who was this woman who had so captured C.S. Lewis that his grief was that evident in this book? Who was this poet and novelist who so enchanted Lewis that he could write something like that? Joy was a brilliant woman. She was a writer. She was a multi-award-winning poet. She was a protege of the MacDowell Artist Colony. She was a novelist. She was well revered in the writing community of New York. She was also a wife with 2 young sons living in upstate New York. So at this time, you have this New York born and bred woman. She had never left New York, but for the 6 months that she wrote screenplays in Hollywood. She is married, she has 2 children, she is an award-winning poet, she is writing, she's trying to balance motherhood, and she's trying to balance writing. Then over here, you have C.S. Lewis. He is a Don at this time at Oxford University, Magdalen College. He has never left Ireland or England, except for the 6 months he was in the war in France. How were these 2 people ever supposed to meet? Much less become friends, much less fall in love, and get married? Forget it. It was an impossible situation, except for the fact that it wasn't an impossible situation. And that's what I wanted to know about. So Joy and Jack's 10-year Eros love story produced some of C.S. Lewis's best work. And once I started to see his work through a new light and realized how Joy had been much more than just his wife and best friend, she had also been his muse, and she had worked with him. I realized that we needed to meet her on new terms. We needed to meet Joy Davidman, not as the woman behind the man, as the phrase goes, but as the woman beside the man. And how often do we get to hear that part of the story? I wanted to know her. I wanted to know who she was, and I knew I wanted to write about her, but I didn't know how. I didn't know from what angle I would break this story because I didn't know her well enough yet. So I started to do my research, and just like any of us, you'll get a different story no matter who you talk to. If you talk to my husband or you talk to my best friend, you're probably going to get two different stories. But what I found with Joy was astounding. There were these two completely different narratives about this woman. On one side, you had this narrative of this brash New York American woman who just blew into Lewis's life and upturned everything. And then over here was this narrative about this amazing, fiery, genius, intellectual woman who Lewis finally felt like he'd found somebody who was as smart as he was, someone he could banter with, someone he played Scrabble with in every language, someone who was a sight memorizer like him, someone who could converse with him about literature and science and faith and theology. And I couldn't reconcile these two different women I was hearing about. So I decided very early on that I only wanted to hear from Joy. I was tired of reading about Joy. I wanted to hear from her. Just like we should treat everybody else. Like, let's hear it from that person. And lucky for me, and lucky for you as the reader or the listener, Joy was a prolific writer. She had probably been writing since she could hold a crayon. And so I have so much work I could read about her, and so much work I could read from her, which was even more important. So I realized that Joy often didn't care what other people thought about her, but I did. So I started to do my research, and I decided that I was going to tell this story from her point of view. I was going to tell it from behind her heart. I was going to tell it from the key of empathy. I was going to tell it in the first person as if I was her. This was a really daring move because C.S. Lewis and Joy Davidman are not unknown people. They already have loads and volumes of things written about them. But I felt like nothing had been told as if from the empathetic point of Joy Davidman. So I started my research. And the first thing I did was start reading everything I could get my hands on that she wrote. And lucky for all of us, there was a volume of letters, of poetry, of essays, she did critical essays about other people's work, and there were novels, and I could get my hands on all of them. And there's this man at Montreat College named Don W. King, and he had compiled all of her poetry and all of her critical thinking in these volumes that I could read. And then the most astounding thing happened about 10 years ago. It was only about 8 years or 7 years when I started writing this novel. But in Oxford, England, in a box, in the back of a closet, in a small cottage in the countryside, Joy's son Douglas went to clean out this house and found a box, a hidden box of Joy's work that had been hidden for all of these years. And in that box were 300 unpublished poems of Joy Davidman's. And they've since been published, but the most astounding thing in that box was a file folder. And on the front of that file folder was the word courage. And inside were 45 love sonnets for C.S. Lewis. I don't have to guess, and neither do you, how Joy Davidman felt about C.S. Lewis, because it was in that box. It was in that box that had been hidden for all of these years. And in those 45 love sonnets, she structures it in such a way that we can see the arc of her feelings. Now, not every love sonnet in those 45 was written after she met him. What Joy did was she took poetry she had already written and put them in this whole string of sonnets. Many of them were written after, but some of them had been written even before she met him, as if she'd been waiting for him, as if she knew he'd been coming for her. So the next thing I did was I traveled to Wheaton, Illinois, because at Wheaton, there is a center called the Wade Center. The Wade Center has all of the papers of Joyce, along with the 7 most important British authors of that day: C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, Charles Williams, George MacDonald, G.K. Chesterton, Dorothy L. Sayers. And in that whole collection are all of Joy's original papers. They have been curated, they have been kept, unpublished papers, letters, oral biographies by her son Douglas. And I was able to sit in that reading room at the Wade Center, where they have the desk that C.S. Lewis wrote on, where they have the typewriter that Joy Davidman used, where they have maps and original papers. And I was able to sit in that reading room, and I felt like time folded in on itself. I found this box that they let me look at after I signed it out and wore gloves and didn't bring in my camera. And in that box, I got to see her marriage certificate, her passport, papers with her notes scribbled, a letter she'd written where her son had doodled on. And I felt like she'd given me permission to start telling this story. The next thing I did, after I felt like I'd read everything I could of hers and touched her papers and really come to know her as best I could, I went to London and to Oxford, because I felt like there was no way that I could tell this story without walking in what I called the steps of joy. So I organized a whole trip based on what was going to be in the novel, and I walked in the steps of joy. I pretended that it was the first time I was her, and it was the first time I saw Lewis at the Eastgate Hotel, or walking into Magdalen College, or walking on Addison's Walk, or visiting the kilns for the first time where C.S. Lewis lived with his brother Warnie. And I infused all of that into the novel. So who was she? And why did I spend all this time researching her? So let me introduce you a little bit to Joy Davidman. Joy Davidman was born in April 1915 in a part of New York that they called the Jewish Ghetto. This was a part of New York where many immigrants came. Joy was the daughter of immigrant parents, Russian and Middle European. And she was born in this place to these parents that one of the most important things to them was assimilation and accomplishment. And Joy lived in this world where everything was about her accomplishments. They were strict. They pushed her really hard. And they pushed her so hard because they knew she was a genius. Joy Davidman could read at 3 years old. At 9 years old, she read H.G. Wells' Outline of the World and announced to her parents that she was an atheist. She graduated from high school when she was 14 years old. She graduated from graduate school when she was 19 years old. She wrote a thesis in graduate school on Lord Orrery that is a masterpiece for an 18 and 19-year-old girl to be writing. She graduated from graduate school and won the Yale Younger Poets Award for her poetry. She published her first novel in her 20s. She was a protege of MacDowell Artist Colony. This woman was on fire. She was a genius, and yet she had these strict parents who kept pushing on her and pushing on her and pushing on her. Well, then she met the man of her dreams, a man she called the mythological perfect husband. His name was William Gresham, and he was also a writer. And they married, and they moved out to a little bit in the country of New York, in upstate New York, and they bought a farm. Bill was a really successful writer himself. He had written a novel that became a movie with Tyrone Power, which was a very big deal in those days. And they had 2 little boys. They had 2 little boys named Davy and Douglas. This is about the time in life where Joy Davidman believes she is the captain of her own soul, that she's got it all figured out. She's had her success. She has these 2 little boys. Then one night, Bill called. Bill had what we would today call PTSD. He had been in the Spanish Civil War. And he called one night and he told Joy that he was not coming home, that he was going to take his own life. And Joy Davidman found herself on her knees in her son's nursery. 2 little babies, alone in upstate New York, on acres of land without a car. And she falls to her knees and she starts to pray. Joy Davidman is an atheist at this time. She has never prayed. She does not know why she is on her knees. She does not know why all of a sudden she found herself praying. And when it was over, she wrote that essay I told you about. And she said things like, it was like waking up. That until then, she had taken her life watered down, diluted by space and time. This is a woman who was at the pinnacle of her career in life, and she had been to the depths of despair, and now she is saying she had taken her life watered down. She said that she saw how much energy she had used just keeping God out. She said that if the knowledge of God was true, then the thinking of her whole life had been false. She said it lasted less than a minute, but in that time, the world cracked open, a door opened, and she was surrounded by love, and she knew that something had happened. And one of my favorite lines that she writes is that she realized that life was too intense to be endured with logic alone. Don't you love that? Life is too intense to be endured with logic alone. But Joy Davidman did not know what this mystical experience was, and she didn't know what to do with it. This is a woman who prided herself on intellectual prowess, who read as wide and deep as a woman can read, and she had no logical explanation for what happened to her. So she spent a couple years trying to figure out what happened to her. And then she remembered and knew and thought about C.S. Lewis, because she had been reading his work through all those years. She had thought him brilliant, but, wrong. So she decided and looked more at his work. So to give you some context, this is about the year 1949 when Joy is deciding whether she should or shouldn't write to C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis is famous right now in 1949, but not as famous as he'll become. He has not yet written the Narnia series, but he has written the Screwtape Letters, The Great Divorce. He has written Pilgrim's Regress. He has been on the cover of Time magazine, and there was an article written about him called Apostle to the Skeptics. And Joy had read that article, Apostle to the Skeptics. So Joy Davidman, being who she is, didn't just read his work or think about what it would mean to read his work more or deeper. She wrote to him because that's who she is. So she found his address and she wrote him a letter. And in January of 1950, C.S. Lewis wrote her back. One of my favorite facts that I learned in my research is that in Warnie's diary, Warnie is C.S. Lewis's brother, and he kept a very detailed diary of everything they did in their lives. And in the diary he wrote, "We have received a letter from the most fascinating American woman." And so obviously whatever she wrote in that letter made a huge impression on both Jack and on Warnie. And Jack wrote her back. And starting in January of 1950, Joy Davidman and C.S. Lewis began an almost 3-year pen friendship. Letters flying back and forth across the ocean until he asked her to call him Jack and she asked him to call her Joy. And they talked about everything that mattered in their life until August of 1952 when Joy Davidman boarded a ship called the SS United States, which as I always feel is very ironic that she boarded the United States to leave the United States and sail across the ocean to meet her friend, Jack Lewis. Now, Joy went to England for loads of reasons in August of 1952. She was writing a book about King Charles and needed to do some research. No such thing as the internet and Google in 1952. And she needed to get to the libraries in Edinburgh. So she was traveling to do that. She had a friend there she was visiting. She had been very sick. Joy had been very sick, and her doctor had told her that she needed to rest and get some medical care, and so she was going to England. But yes, she also went to meet her friend Jack Lewis. And this is when the story gets really good, but not because it gets easy. This is where the story gets good because they both Jack and Joy, have so many obstacles to overcome. Internal obstacles, external obstacles, familial, community. They have so many obstacles to overcome. And that's what makes the story so interesting. That's what makes this a true hero's journey, that both of them had to overcome things to come together. So sometimes we focus on the end result. If you've ever seen the movie Shadowlands, which is one of my favorite movies, Deborah Winger plays Joy, and Anthony Hopkins plays C.S. Lewis. And it's a beautiful story, but it is the end of the story. And sometimes we focus on the end result of the story, and we ignore the journey that it took to get to where they are today, and to where the happy ending happened. And this book was meant to show us that convoluted and complicated path that it took for them to be together. So if Joy was with us tonight, and she was here to talk about what this story means, and what it means to us, and what it means to everybody out here, what would she want for us to take from her story? What would she want for us to know that she has to say to us today? I think her story talks to us about a number of things, so I'm going to tell you what I think some of those are. Number one, I think her story really talks to us about the power of story, about writing, and about asking questions. Joy Davidman stood there after her mystical experience and said, I know there is something more. I know there is something real. I know that a door has opened and there is something more, and I want to know what that something more is. And instead of numbing that down, instead of ignoring it, she kept searching. Joy Davidman, when she was a teenager and an atheist, she wrote a poem arguing with Jesus about his resurrection. And when she looked back, she realized she had written that poem on Easter. All of her life, she had been asking the bigger questions. One of my favorite poets is a man named David Whyte. He's an English and Irish poet, and he often talks about asking the beautiful question. And I think that's what Joy did. I think she was always willing to ask the beautiful question. There's a poem David Whyte writes where he says that there are certain questions that we ask that can make or unmake a life. And I believe that those are the kind of questions that Joy asked. And some of those questions she asked did unmake her life. And I think those are the important questions. And I think she would tell us to ask those questions. She was looking for something that would satisfy her heart, her logic, her intellect, and her mind. And she never stopped looking. She didn't think anything was the final answer, and that set her off on this life path. I think she would tell us to always look for the unseen threads in our life. She could have ignored that mystical moment. She could have put it up to pure emotion and let it go. She could have said, well, that was crazy, and just went on with her life. But she didn't, because she was always looking for the seen that shimmers, the unseen that shimmers underneath the seen. And I think that's what we do when we read or write poetry or read literature. We're looking for the unseen threads. And because she was always looking for them, she found them. I'm going to give you some of the really amazing unseen threads that brought Joy and Jack together. They were both geniuses, and they both struggled with this internal dichotomy between reason and imagination. They both wrote about that dichotomy and how were they ever to meld reason and imagination. Lewis, for those Lewis scholars and readers out there, you know that Lewis says that imagination is the vehicle to meaning. And so they were both always looking for this kind of, how do we reconcile these two things in our lives? They were both writers and intellectuals from the very beginning of their life. They were both originally atheists who God came in. When I was doing my research, one of the people I talked to and interviewed was a man named Lyle Dorset, who was here at Samford. And he had written the very first biography about Joy David-Min about 25 years ago. And he titled that biography exactly right, and that's "And God Came In." And it happened to both Lewis and to Joy. And they had that in common. They had this unseen thread. In fact, they both wrote about the moment when God came in, and I love this. She called herself, in her essay, long before Lewis wrote about his conversion in his biography, in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, she called herself the world's most astonished atheist. Well, Lewis years later wrote that he called himself the world's most dejected and reluctant convert in all of England. Sounds a little bit the same. They both were fascinated by mythology for all of their life. In fact, eventually they wrote a book together called Till We Have Faces. And this is one of the things that really fascinated me when I was writing this book, was that I took those last 10 years of Lewis's work and read them again with a new eye and realized that Joy David-Min's fingerprints were all over that work. And she co-wrote Till We Have Faces with him. And Till We Have Faces is a retelling of the myth of Cupid and Psyche. And once again, the unseen threads of their lives finally wove together for this amazing piece of literature that Lewis calls by far and away his best novel. Joy read and was profoundly impacted by George MacDonald's book Phantastes, exactly 17 years after Lewis read and was profoundly impacted by George MacDonald's book Phantastes. And I know I'm probably saying that title wrong. But they both read this book and set off on this huge reading of fantasy and fairy tale and the unseen underneath the scene and Irish mythology and Celtic spirituality. And they both set off on this journey from this one book. C.S. Lewis has said that that book baptized his imagination, and Joy had been equally impacted by it. They both originally wanted to be poets, which I find so fascinating. If you don't know this about C.S. Lewis, you will read about it in Becoming Mrs. Lewis. His first desire was to be a poet. His first published book was of poetry, Spirits in Bondage. And he found that his hand was better at prose than poetry. So he was always admiring Joy's poetry, and he was quite enamored of her mastery of the craft. Meanwhile, Joy wanted to write prose and write really amazing novels, but her gift was in poetry. And that these two came together in this way, wanting the opposite of what they were both so amazing at, is fascinating to me. So I think she'd ask us to ask ourselves, what are we missing in our lives by not being quiet and looking at the unseen threads that wind underneath? How often do we miss those things because we're not paying attention? I think she would talk to us about the pain and arrogance that we use to build an armor around ourselves. Joy had a really tough childhood. She was often sick. Her parents were strict. She had a terrible marriage with Bill. He was a philanderer. He was an alcoholic. He was not as nice as one would hope a husband might be. And she had used all of that pain and built this kind of armor of arrogance and this armor of intellect and witty bon mots and just, I'm fine, you can't bother me. And inside was this vulnerable, hurting woman, and eventually that armor broke. And I think she would talk to us about not using the pain to build armor, but using it to grow softer, which is eventually what happened with her. When her facade broke down, much of the themes Until We Have Faces is about removing the veil and removing the mask. So eventually this breaking down of her armor was used for good. And I think she would talk to us about using our pain and using it to break through to others, using it in our literature and in our art, and not using it to build an armor of arrogance. I think she would absolutely talk to us about our worthiness and our individuality. I think she would talk to us about how it's okay to be different than those around you. Especially for women, I think she would really talk about how it's okay to be different, how we are all made in the Maker's image in different ways, and we are not meant to be the same. Joy spent an incredible amount of time and energy trying to satisfy her parents, trying to please her husband, trying to be who everybody else was telling her to be. And I think she would tell us that seeking approval is crippling to our life and to our purpose, and that we don't have to do it the way everybody else does it. I think she would talk to us about how when you acquiesce to something that you know is not who you are, that you damage your own soul. She would talk to us about finding out who we are in Christ and finding out who we are apart from the definitions of other people. We might not all need to pack up our bags and move to England and take our kids like Joy Davidman did, but I think she would tell us that we do need to pack up everybody else's expectations and definitions of who we are. I think she would tell us that we need to search for the truth and constantly turn to it again and again. I think she would talk a lot about collaboration and friendship. One of my favorite quotes is she talks about working with C.S. Lewis, and she says, "My real gift is a sort of editor-collaborator like Max Perkins. And I'm happiest when I'm doing something like that. Though I can't write 1/10 as well as Jack, I can tell him how to write more like himself." I do believe that she would talk to us about having deep friendships where we're honest and where we collaborate and where we help each other. I think she would talk to us about seeking. Mystical experience is all good and well, but the seeking is what brought her to the truth. She would talk about never stop asking the questions. The last words in her conversion essay were, "In his will is our peace," which is a Dantean reference, obviously. And then, according to Lewis, her last words on earth were, "I am at peace with God." And I love that these two bookend statements, the last words in her essay and the last words of hers on earth were, "In his will is our peace, and I am at peace with God." And I think it is fascinating that the years and trust-filled spaces between those two statements are where she was the most courageous, the most creative, and the most loved in all of her life. I think she would talk to us too about our creative life and how we should never stop. And I know that a creative life is different for everyone, and I don't mean everyone should be a writer or an artist, because whatever we're doing is creative if we're tapping into it. But so many people tried to get her to stop writing and be a mother, stop the poetry, stop the writing, support your husband, support your family. But she would tell us, don't ever stop expressing yourself through creativity. It is the lifeblood of our souls. It is what helps us find what Thomas Merton calls our hidden wholeness. And I believe she would talk to us about that. So what does Joy tell us? Joy tells us that the search for truth with a capital T and the search for love is worth the convoluted and complicated pathway to changing our lives. When I finished this book, and it wasn't yet in the world, I didn't know how it would be received. The only person I had interviewed for this book was Lyle Dorsett here at Samford University, because I really only wanted to hear from Joy, like I said before. But I knew that I was going to have to talk to her son. I knew that I was going to have to talk to her only living relative. His name is Douglas Gresham. And I knew that I would need permission from the C.S. Lewis Company for some of the things I had in the novel. I could have published this novel without their permission, But it wouldn't have been as rich as it is because I used Joy's poetry at the beginning of every single chapter. And I knew that I needed those to stay. And I put very real words in all of their mouths. So I had looked at the book like this. So I'm talking to you who ever want to write historical fiction or who are curious about how it worked. I knew that the skeleton of this book needed to be factual, that I could not sway from dates or times or births or publication dates of books. And I knew I needed to talk to her son. But I hadn't done it yet. I was a little bit like Scarlett O'Hara, and I'll worry about that another day. And then, while the book was out for submission, and I was deciding who was going to publish it, or they were deciding who was going to publish me, I received an email in my inbox. And it said, "Hello, Patti. My name is Douglas Gresham, and I hear you have been asking after my mother." And my heart just stopped because I wanted to get to him first. But you see, Douglas Gresham lives in Malta. I can't really get to Malta the same way I can get to Samford University and interview Lyle. So I didn't know what to do. And I called my agent and I said, "I have an email from Douglas. What do I say?" And she said, "Well, how did he find you?" And I said, "He found me because the Wade Center, where I had been doing all of my research and had kept very close in touch with them and was constantly sending them questions and, do you have this file? Do you have that file? What year did Joy do this? What was the name of her thesis?" They told him when he went to do some oral biographies that I had been asking after his mother. So I said, "What do I do?" And she said, "You tell him the truth." I was like, that's a really good idea. So I emailed Douglas back and I said, "I have written a novel about your mother, and I have written a novel about your mother to honor her. I have written a novel about your mother because I believe that people need to hear her story. I think that people need to hear her story beyond the dying wife of C.S. Lewis that made him write A Grief Observed. I believe that she has not had her due, and I wanted to be able to do that." And then I waited, and because the time zone is a bit different between here and Malta, I kept clicking refresh, and telling myself, it's 2 a.m. there, he's not gonna answer you. And I woke up the next morning to an email that said, "Bravo." And my heart just sang. So we started emailing back and forth, and I started asking him questions, and I started talking to him about his mother, and then we talked on the phone, and I realized he must be in the United States because he'd been at the Wade Center. So I said, "Where are you right now?" And he said, "I am in Asheville, North Carolina." And at that moment, I was in Spartanburg, South Carolina, speaking at a library. And I said, "Do not move." And he didn't. And I went and spent the day with him hearing stories about the woman that I had spent the previous 2 years writing about. And he told me stories about her. And what I was most astounded by was how many times I'd gotten it right. Not because I'm such a great writer, but because I had been so committed to her words and to what she said and not to the hearsay of other people. And I was so astounded by that I could not stop letting him tell me stories. And he's a storyteller, so he didn't stop either. And I learned about his brother, and I did add a couple things, but I did not change that much. In fact, I didn't change anything. I just added a little bit after I met with him. And he too confirmed to me that her life, her courage, her bravery finally answered that question. If we should ever grow brave, what on earth would become of us?
Thank you so much, Patti, for giving us a glimpse into the remarkable relationship of Joy Davidman and C.S. Lewis, but perhaps even more so, giving us a glimpse into the life and the heart of Joy Davidman. We're deeply grateful for you being here tonight. We're also grateful that you have foregone your speaker honorarium this evening to support something that is very close to our hearts, and that is the Jewel Littleton Scholarship. It's awarded to minority students of any classification who demonstrate significant financial need and are pursuing a degree offered in the Orlean Beeson School of Education here at Samford. We're delighted to share with you and with our audience the impact of gifts in support of scholarships like the one that honors Jewel Littleton through a short presentation. We then encourage all of you to stay tuned, please, for a question and answer time with Patti immediately following the video.
The Orlean Beeson School of Education enriches the community and empowers students to educate, lead, and serve. Students in the School of Education have the opportunity to work alongside their faculty who are experts in their fields, and because of this, they can enter their professions with more confidence. They're learning from scholars and practitioners who are well connected and who are networked and who understand the value of connecting theory to practice. Donors who invest in our scholarships are providing an opportunity for Samford graduates to impact the world. They're going to go out and fulfill their mission because of what you have enabled them to do financially.
I applied only to Samford, and when I applied, my mom said, in order for you to stay on campus, you've got to get a scholarship. It was something special about Samford, and I wanted to be here. So being able to get additional funding was a godsend, and I sing Samford's praises every day.
I made a promise to my mother. I am the son of a school teacher, and technically I'm a third generation educator, so it's been in my blood for years. One of her biggest things was that she always wanted to push me, and she always told me to go further than she did. I was able to not only receive my bachelor's degree, my master's degree, my education specialist degree, and here I am now at Samford University working toward and almost at completion of my final degree, which would be my doctoral degree. To get that scholarship was an additional boost for me. That was so much more encouraging. I'm like, okay, that eased up a couple of things for me to make sure that I could stay in school, but it actually encouraged me to keep going forward. A scholarship is something that could be that make or break point for that person. They could be the best student, but there still may be a financial hardship. This scholarship is going to be the key to their future. Or giving to a scholarship could be just that signal, like, okay, keep going. Don't stop, keep going. You got a bill? Here, keep going.
To join Mrs. Henry in making a gift, you can visit samford.edu/give/courts.
Wow, that's amazing. And before we get rolling with the Q&A, I wish everyone out there, I wish you could flash me your questions and I could answer them. I really want to thank you, Dean McEwen and Provost Harbin and Kathy Acton. You guys, it's amazing. The program you have here, the things you're doing, it's astounding, and I'm honored to be here. So because we can't hear you ask the questions, some people sent some in, and I'm going to answer a couple of them. This one says, the letters in the novel. Did you make them up, or are they real? How did you decide what to make historically accurate and what to make imagined? So the letters in the novel are imagined, or I like to say inspired. And here's why. All of those letters, I told you they were pen friends for almost 3 years. All of those letters have been lost. Now we know why Lewis's letters were lost, because he never saved letters. He felt that people really wrote to him about personal things and he didn't want anybody else to ever read them. So Lewis's are understandable, but Joy's were gone too. Her son Douglas says that they were stored in a trunk that was broken into and vandalized, and the letters are gone. So I had to imagine the letters between them. And the way that I did that was that I waited until I was mostly finished with the novel, when I felt like I really knew their voices in a much bigger way than I did in the beginning. And because we have volumes and volumes of letters from both of them to other people, we know what they were talking about back then. I know what they were interested in, worried about, and discussing in the years of 1950 to 1952, because they were writing to other people about it. And sometimes Joy would write a letter where she would write to someone else about what Lewis wrote to her. And so I had some of that also. As far as how did I decide what could be imagined and what would be historically accurate, I try to describe it this way. If you imagine the novel as a person, and like I said earlier, the skeleton are the facts. The skeleton of this novel are when they were born, when they died, what year things were published, when their children were born, when Lewis moved to Cambridge, all of that. Those facts could not be altered, or the skeleton of the book would fall apart, and the whole story would fall apart. I did not want to bend time in a novel like you can in a movie or a TV series. In this novel, since I was telling it from her point of view, I really needed that skeleton to be firm. And that required not only a lot of research, but some crazy looking charts in my office with timelines and stickies and notes, and move that sticky over there, move that over there, and because I needed to make sure that I didn't put anything of the skeleton in the wrong place. So now that you've imagined the skeleton, the next thing that would go on this person, that is my novel, would be the skin. And I like to imagine that part as the emotional truth. So if the bones are the facts, then the emotional truth is the skin. And the emotional truth came from her and her work, and most importantly, from her poetry. And most importantly, from the love sonnets that she wrote to C.S. Lewis, the 45 love sonnets that were in a folder labeled Courage. So that became the skin of this novel person. And then the clothes that I put on that novel person is what the parts that are imagined, the parts that are inspired. And yet, every time I put words in their mouth, there's no way we can know what they said to each other, unless, like Joy did once in a while, where she wrote a letter and would say what Lewis said to her. Otherwise, we have no idea what they said to each other. There was not a stenographer following them around. And so I had to imagine it. There's no way that we can know when or if she gave him those poems. But from all my research, I really believe, and most experts do, that she did. But when? When did she first tell him that she loved him? Those are things that we can't put in a biography because we don't know. But I can imagine them, and that imagination has to come from inspired knowledge. It has to come from already doing the research so that you can make an educated and inspired guess. So, okay, the next question. What was your biggest takeaway personally from this novel? Wow. So I think I talked a little bit about that when I talked about what I think she has to say to us. And one of the things I think she really taught me personally is that it's okay to never stop asking the questions. It's okay to not know the answers. It's okay not to believe what you're told, that it's okay to ask the bigger questions. What I was talking about before, it's okay to ask the beautiful question. It's okay to keep seeking and keep asking and not stay stagnant. The other question, why did you do a podcast and what is it about? Yeah, so usually fiction novels don't have podcasts. Usually podcasts are for nonfiction books or for lectures or for series. And I'm a huge podcast listener. I listen to podcasts when I'm traveling, when I'm working around the house, when I'm taking a walk. I can't get enough of really good podcasts. So maybe that was in the back of my mind. But when the novel was finished and it was published, I was standing around with my publishing people, my amazing editor, Amanda Bostic, and my PR people and my marketing people, HarperCollins, Thomas Nelson, and we were talking about the book and how it was about to be out in the world and how much research and writing I had done that wasn't in the novel, and how heartbreaking that was for me. Because honestly, y'all, if I had put everything I learned and wanted to put in this novel, it would have been a trilogy. And I know nobody wanted to wait 3 books to hear C.S. Lewis say, "I love you" to her. So I knew that I had to trim the book down, and I knew that I could not write about every fascinating thing I learned about Joy Davidman. For example, there was a 6-month period where she wrote screenplays in Hollywood, and that was fascinating. When she was there, she helped raise the MGM lion named Leo. Imagine this, right? Here's this woman who eventually meets Aslan, who spent time in Hollywood helping raise the MGM lion. Lions are a theme throughout the whole novel, so I really hated leaving that out. And so much of her poetry I couldn't put in there, or her time in graduate school. So we were talking about the things that ended up on the cutting room floor and the research I had done that couldn't all be put inside this novel. So we started talking about what to do with all that extra information. What do we do with this cachet of fascinating information? And I said, what about a podcast? And they were like, that's brilliant. Might not have been brilliant, but it was a great, fun idea. And so I rounded up 8 separate interviews. And I interviewed everybody I could think of, and of course, after I finished, I thought of a ton more, who I thought really influenced the book. 2 of the podcasts are with her son, Douglas Gresham. So you get to hear about their childhood. You get to hear about being C.S. Lewis's stepson. You get to hear about how it was for him. Douglas lost his mother, his father, and his stepfather all in a 3-year period, because Lewis died 3 years after Joy passed away. So 2 of them are with Douglas. I interview Don W. King, who is an expert on her poetry, and we talk about those love sonnets. We talk about some of the scandalous love sonnets. We talk about whether he did or didn't give them, she did or didn't give them to him. I talked to 2 fascinating doctorate women named Dr. Crystal Hurd and Dr. Crystal Downing, and I talk about the women that prepared C.S. Lewis for Joy Davidman, which were his mother, who was a fascinating woman, who had a degree in math in the 1800s in Belfast, Ireland. And then we talk about the other woman that everyone believes paved the way for joy in Lewis's life, and that is Dorothy L. Sayers, the mystery writer and the woman who wrote Mind of the Maker, who also taught herself as an adult to read Latin so she could translate Dante. And Douglas has said that he saw Lewis cry twice in his life. One was when Joy died, and one is when Dorothy L. Sayers died. So these interviews are so fascinating, and they really give a lot of depth to the novel because we dive into things that I didn't get to dive into in the novel. I interview a man named Andrew Lazo, who is an expert on Till We Have Faces and how Joy and Jack collaborated in that novel, and how, in his words, he was surprised by love, which, as you know, is a play on words because Jack's autobiography is Surprised by Joy, which is the emotion joy, not the person joy. And then I interview Max McLean, who is, he has the play that goes all around the country called The Reluctant Convert, and he plays C.S. Lewis. Max McLean has devoted his life to the theater and putting on the stage not only C.S. Lewis's story, but the stories he's written. And these interviews in this podcast kind of round out the novel in a way that made me feel like all of that research I did hadn't gone to waste. So that is why I wrote about that. And I think there is one more question here. What was the biggest surprise for you when you were writing the novel, when you were doing your research? So many things surprised me. I couldn't believe that nobody had told me what an influence Joy was on Jack's life, and more importantly, on his work. I was also incredibly surprised by how accomplished she was. I didn't realize that she had won the Yale Younger Poets Award, that she had graduated from high school at 14, that she had written a thesis on Lord Orrery that was a masterpiece, that her genius was well on display in her younger years. But as I started to learn about who she was and how adept she was at poetry and her genius, and then how she, after that, started to influence Lewis's work, I thought, why have we not heard it this way? And when I looked back and read some of his work and saw some of the themes that mattered the most to them, I was really astounded. So that was probably the most surprising for me. And I want to thank you for having me. And I hope that when you read this novel, you meet Joy Davidman on her terms. And I hope that you find a new C.S. Lewis, a man, that was the other surprising thing for me, a man who had his own hurts and pains in life. When we talk about C.S. Lewis, we put him on a pedestal, or we often put him on a pedestal, and we quote him and we talk about him as a saint sometimes. And he was an extraordinary man. I don't know if there will ever be anyone like him. He might be one of the most well-known names in the world. And yet, I met a C.S. Lewis that lost his mother at 9 years old, who sat in the trenches of World War I and watched his best friend and his lieutenant be killed right next to him. I met a man who was turned down 3 times for a professorship at Oxford University. A man who struggled with his own faith and with love, a man who lived with an amazing brother, a brilliant brother who also was an alcoholic, and he took care of him. A man who kept his promises and his integrity, but had his own hurts and wounds in life. And sometimes when we talk about Lewis, we don't talk about those things. We talk about his incredible books and his quotes and how he's affected our lives. And I hope that when you read this novel, you meet him as a human being, heart to heart. And thank you for having me.
Thank you, Patti. You have brought to this event the very things that we hope to accomplish. Food for thought, the opportunity to look at something from a different perspective. So we're delighted that you joined us this evening. A special thank you to Marla and to the Corts family, and to each of you for joining us for the 10th anniversary of Tom and Marla Corts' Distinguished Author Series. We hope you have a very good night.